Nicola Polloni is Alexander von Humboldt postdoctoral fellow at the Humboldt University of Berlin and has recently written a fantastic monograph on Gundesalinus, who you know is the key mediator between Arabic and Jewish philosophy in the Middle Ages and the Latin West. But Nicola's interests are very broad on this whole period, and he's focusing especially right now on the idea of prime matter, and has been doing a lot of work on Roger Bacon, the president of and founder of the Roger Bacon Society, if I understand.
Not president. President is Jerry, please.
Oh, Jerry. Okay. Well, one of the founding members of the Roger Bacon Society, and so is going to share with us on Roger Bacon and his research on prime matter today. So,
thank you, Lydia. Yeah. And thank you all for being here today. The forecast for today says that could be some thunderstorms, so I hope it's not going to be a problem with the connection. I mean, I'm in Italy at the moment, so it's a bit different than when I'm in Berlin. So thank you for being here today. And can you hear me just fine, I hope? So we're going to explore today the notion of prime matter as thought by Bacon. So the notions of matter and prime matter are among, as you know, the most debated points in medieval philosophy. As explanatory device, matter was supposed to carry out central functions in both the analysis of being as such, that is in metaphysics, and the study of corporeal beings and their change in natural philosophy. Its originality, Bacon's theory is also remarkably complex. His inclination to distinguish between different considerations of matter, as well as his extreme realism and radical reading of the matter-form correspondence, affected significantly his theory. Today, I want to examine with you one problematic point of Bacon's theory. How can we have knowledge of prime matter? The problem concerning the epistemology of prime matter is old and intricate. It has been addressed by both Plato and Aristotle and would mark abundant aspects of early modern criticism against Aristotelianism. During the Middle Ages, different solutions were elaborated in order to resolve the conundrum of how to grasp something that is mostly potential and formless. Indeed, how could we know something that is completely or almost completely potential and has no form at all? At the same time, if no knowledge of prime matter is possible, such epistemic emptiness would cast a dark shadow over the edifices of natural philosophy and metaphysics, which would be grounded, at least in part, on an unconceivable principle. This is why medieval thinkers formulated a variety of strategies to open an epistemic access to prime matter. Among these strategies, the most relevant ones were analogy and negative abstraction. While commenting Aristotle's physics, Roger Bacon had to examine in detail the theory of matter upon which natural isomorphism is based. Among the various questions it asks, 4 are explicitly dedicated to how matter can be known. One could think that matter cannot be accessed in any way, as it is the entity that hinders and limits our cognition of corporeal beings. According to Bacon, that would be a mistaken and naive stance. Matter exists, and because it exists, it can be known. Yet what kind of matter is that? And how can we attain some knowledge of this entity? Bacon is rather vague about the first question. He oscillates between different considerations of matter that usually exclude prime matter from the picture, aside from one special case, that of God's knowledge. In the remainder of Bacon's discussion, it just refers to matter, and with this term, as we shall see, it means the metaphysical, proximate matter of the composite and never its physical or secondary matter. Examining the modalities by which matter can be conceived, Bacon distinguishes between 2 very different cases, that of God and that of the humans. These cognitive agents have different abilities and ontological statuses, which imply a different way by which they can know matter. Both cases also entail some problematic aspects. how can God know prime matter, considering that the divine mind is replenished with forms and there is no potency in his being? This is a rather delicate point, as Thomas Aquinas' famous denial of this possibility would display. Bacon's answer moves through various considerations. On the one hand, God is a voluntary agent who knows both the effects and the instruments which he used in creating the universe. On the other hand, as creatures have some knowledge of God, he must have even more knowledge of his creation, matter included. The main point of Bacon's answer, however, is remarkably Platonic. It distinguishes between immanent forms, that is, the Aristotelian forms joined to matter in the composite, and the transcendent exemplar forms, which are close to the Platonic ideas and correspond to the ideas that God has of the essences of things. Prime matter is opposite only to immanent forms, and not to the exemplar ones. Because prime matter has an essence, there must be an idea of it in God's mind. And through this idea, God has direct knowledge of the prime matter he created. But what about humans? Can we have knowledge of prime matter? The final two questions of Bacon's set discussed this central problem. Matter and form are essentially different. In fact, they're opposite. Being essentially different, matter can be known as other than the form, since we can and do distinguish between matter and form. As Bacon observes, I quote, "The human intellect distinguishes matter from form by distinguishing the essence of matter from the essence of the form, as it is said in the 7th book of Metaphysics. Therefore, the human intellect knows matter and form." End of quotation. For Bacon, the key to unlock the conceivability of matter is the ontological correlation between matter and form. Bacon's reference to the hylomorphic correlation can be better appreciated by considering the list of definitions of matter that Bacon provides in his Communia Naturalium. There, Bacon lists 3 non-equivocal definitions of matter which refer precisely to the hylomorphic correlation from which the composite emerges. They claim, respectively, that matter is the substrate of alteration, definition 4, that is the substrate of generation and corruption, definition 5, and that is one of the constituents of the composite, definition 6. In this context, Bacon points out that the most proper definition of matter is given by definition 6. Indeed, it expresses the functional correlation of matter and form within the hylomorphic composite, which in turn, following Bacon's universal hylomorphism, corresponds to created being as such. Consistently with definition 6, the path we have to follow to attain knowledge of matter is the consideration of the hylomorphic correspondence. After having clarified that a complete cognition of matter is impossible, Bacon claims that matter, I quote, is known by the form like privation is known by the form and potency is known by the act. End of quotation. Now, if we consider that the set of questions is introduced by asking whether matter can be known by analogy, and also Bacon's reference to potency as knowable by considering the act, it is quite clear that, according to Bacon, matter can be known by analogy to the form. It should be recalled that in Physics 1.7, Aristotle claims that matter can be known by analogy. However, Aristotle characterizes this analogy as an analogy to the composite rather than to the form. The same procedure is presented again in relation to the analogical knowledge of potency by means of the act in Metaphysics 9.6, a passage recalled by Bacon. Notwithstanding the letter of Aristotle's works, and probably inspired by Averroes, many 13th century philosophers interpreted the passage as presenting an analogy to the form of the composite rather than to the composite itself. And this seems to be the path followed by Bacon. However, what does it mean that matter can be known by analogy to the form? It seems to me that 2 options are possible. A first interpretation would consider the analogy to the form as a specification of the analogy to the composite claimed by Aristotle, and following the assumption that the composite is shaped by the form and therefore any analogy to the composite is implicitly an analogy to the form. According to this weak interpretation, the analogy can be referred to how formal qualifications of something are related to their material, which is shaped by them. You can find an explanatory chart of this interpretation in your handout. According to this interpretation, the analogy to the form should be considered as an analogy between two different kinds of relations. On the one hand, the relation between secondary matter and its formal qualifications, and on the other hand, the relation between proximate matter and its form. In other words, from a consideration of how the formal aspects of, let's say, a bench shape the timber of which that bench is made, we can draw an analogy to how the form of the bench ontologically shapes its metaphysical matter. As I said, this interpretation of the analogy follows the assumption that the analogy to the composite can be read as an analogy to the form, because the form is the main ontological aspect qualifying the composite. For this reason, it seems that the analogy which results from the weak interpretation is an analogy to the form only in a quite derivative way. A second option is to consider matter and form only, focusing on their correlation and without considering the composite. Bacon repeatedly claims that matter requires form and form requires matter. Matter is other than the form and needs it to be completed. The form also requires matter in order to produce the composite. Characterizing both hylomorphic partners, this ontological correlation can be cracked analogically. Accordingly, by considering the form as analogous to matter, yet opposite to it, one can see that as the form requires something to be born and to actualize, so matter requires something to bear, and by which being actualized. Although the cognitive gains of this procedure are questionable, it is nonetheless able to provide some knowledge of matter focusing only on the form without requiring any analogical reference to the composite and secondary matter. Bacon does not make clear which interpretation of the analogy to the form is following. As we shall see, the strong interpretation is closer to his ontological discussion. Yet, that discussion does not exclude that he was adhering to a weaker interpretation of the analogical procedure. In both cases, Bacon is clear in his claim that the analogy between matter and form provides some insights of what prime matter is. Bacon's analogical procedure follows closely the three definitions of matter from Communia Naturalium, and particularly definition 6, on which both definitions 4 and 5 are grounded. However, the most pressing issue here is to understand what kind of matter Bacon has in mind when he claims that matter can be known by analogy. According to Bacon, this analogy is established within the ontological realm of the hylomorphic composite. In other words, a matter X is known by analogy to the form X, to which it is joined in the composite X, at the same ontological level. This means that the matter which is known by analogy is primarily the proximate matter of a hylomorphic composite. In this regard, it seems that, at least theoretically, the analogical strategy can be applied also to the knowledge of prime matter. The correlation to the form in each considered domain is indeed horizontal. The form of a table is related to the matter of a table as prime matter is related to the first form. In order to understand this point, we need to consider how specific matters and secondary matters are interrelated in Bacon's ontology. Accordingly, we need a brief excursus into Roger Bacon's hylomorphism. Well, his ontology is far from parsimonious. Bacon's metaphysics is based on three main assumptions. First, the being of every creature is characterized by a purely hylomorphic structure, since Bacon adheres to universal hylomorphism. Second, the hylomorphic structure is not monomorphic. That is, there is not only one substantial form joining matter, because substance is organized into a plurality of non-incidental forms qualifying the composite, which corresponds to Bacon's formal pluralism. Third, the universal features we reason about must exist in re, that is, have a real existence within each and every hylomorphic composite expressing them, which corresponds to Bacon's extreme realism. These three theories universal allomorphism, formal pluralism, and extreme realism are intertwined and produce Bacon's unique ontological perspective. Bacon's adherence to universal allomorphism entails a grounding role for matter. Creation as a whole is hylomorphic constituted, and every creature is made of matter and form. In turn, formal pluralism implies that the ontological structure of each creature is specified by a multitude of substantial forms hierarchically disposed into variants of the so-called Porphyrian tree. The root of these trees is the most general of all genera, the genus generalissimum, which is made of prime matter and the first form, while their branches are the composites in which the most special of all species are instantiated. This scheme is made more complex by Bacon's extreme realism, which implies the presence in re of a dual ontological structure of universal and individual features within any considerate thing. According to Bacon, in order to make true claims about individual and universal feature of something, we must admit that that something has both individual and universal qualifications in its ontological structure. This is the core of Bacon's realism, and according to it, we have to posit two different Porphyrian trees in each composite, related to the universal and individual consideration of the thing, respectively. However, the core of Bacon's ontology lays elsewhere, at least in my opinion. The grounding element of his ontology is his strong interpretation of the principle of perfect hylomorphic correspondence, claiming that for every level Z of the specification of a substance X, the form Fz can be joined to and only to the corresponding matter Mz at the same level Z. The principle can be summarized by a simple claim. Every form must have a matter up to it. Following Aristotle, this claim was very common in the Middle Ages. But this claim can also be contrasted to another very common claim that considered prime matter as able to receive any form. Being completely potential in the substrate of the created universe, prime matter must be able to receive the forms of every substance. From the second claim, some questions seem to arise. If they share the same matter, how does it happen that the form of an apple can be joined only to the chunk of matter of that apple and not to the chunk of matter of a squirrel? Why the apple in front of me does not become occasionally a squirrel? To avoid these problems, the principle of perfect hylomorphic correspondence must be complemented by additional explanatory tools specifying the intentionality of the acquisition of forms during natural change. However, Roger Bacon's solution takes another direction. According to Bacon, without perfect hylomorphic correspondence, the natural world would be marked by an ontological anarchy according to which anything could randomly become anything else. In addition, Bacon interprets the requisite for the form to have its proper matter in a rather strong fashion. According to him, matter cannot be considered here in its equivocal meaning of secondary or physical matter. That would correspond to a weak interpretation of the hylomorphic correspondence, which was quite common among medieval upholders of formal pluralism. They often maintained that the vertical series of forms was joined to different degrees of specified matter, like the form of a bench is joined to the timber, which is already a composite functioning as matter. According to Bacon, this cannot be the case. The claim that a form must be joined to a matter proper to it entails that every form is joined to its own metaphysical matter. That is to say, to a matter considered as metaphysical ingredient and not as a secondary matter, which is the physical matter of the thing and itself a composite. This perfect hylomorphic correspondence describes the ontological correlation between form and matter established by definition 6 of the Communia Naturalium. Therefore, it must be referred to the relationship between true matter and form, not to the hylomorphic composite et a form. As a consequence, one has to admit that every substantial form has its own matter, and that the matter they join is truly and not equivocally matter. Bacon's strong interpretation of the principle of perfect hylomorphic correspondence has two central implications. If every form has its own matter, one has to admit that there is a plurality of matters vertically ordered to mirror the vertical order of their corresponding forms. And also that these matters are specified independently from the forms, since otherwise they would be hylomorphic composites. As a consequence, Bacon triples his Porphyrian trees and the renowned illustrations accompanying the Commonia Naturalium. Because each level requires both specified forms and specified matters, Bacon has to include a tree for the specification of both form and matter, together with the main tree presenting the specification of the composite. Then, they are doubled, since there is one series for the individual features and one for the universal features. Accordingly, we now have 6 trees for one apple, as you can see in your handout. The point I want to stress here is that Bacon's theory neatly distinguishes between specific matter, which is matter considered as metaphysical ingredient of the composite and constitute the tree of matter, and secondary matter, which is matter considered as the material of the composite, its functional matter like the timber of a wooden bed. This matter is not properly matter, but another level of hylomorphic composite indicated by the tree of the composite. Evidently, the matter we can know by analogy is specific matter, and mostly the last layer of the specification of matter, which is usually called proximate matter. The root of all specific matters is prime matter, the substrate of the most general of all genera. Rooted so deeply in the constitution of the thing, it seems that analogy can hardly be applied to the knowledge of prime matter. In order to do so, we need another epistemic procedure able to lead us to a consideration of the composite made of prime matter, so to focus on the hylomorphic correlation constituting it. The only available path seems then to be negative abstraction, by which we can go below what we see in the first substances. The abstractive procedure allows us to move upwards in the tree of the composite from a more special secondary matter to one less so. In fact, we can proceed with the removal of all qualifications until we find their common substrate. According to this process, we can even get to conceive the generic matter of the universe, which is the genus generalissimum, not prime matter. Indeed, abstraction is only able to attain knowledge of matter considered as secondary matter. The removal of qualifications can only provide knowledge of the substrate below what we see. Yet, that substrate is a composite. It is a secondary matter, not matter properly considered. Arguing against the upholder of monooulism, the theory claiming that there is only one metaphysical matter, which is prime matter for all things, Bacon stresses that his opponents mistakenly applied abstraction to the consideration of matter as metaphysical rather than functional or physical aspect of the composite. As Bacon observes, I quote, "In this way, we do not consider matter like in the said error. There, indeed, matter is considered as the other part of the composite, which is a simple substance essentially different from the form. Here, in turn, we consider matter as some incomplete composite, which is the essence of some genus that is in potency to the species following it. And matter is always interpreted in this way according to natural philosophy as a whole, and when we talk about the subject of generation, which is matter. On the contrary, the metaphysician mainly examines the simple matter because in the 7th book of Metaphysics is ascertained that matter is other than the essence of whatever predicable and much more." End of quotation. Given this context, it is now possible to answer the question of how prime matter can be known. Bacon's dual consideration of matter led him to consider negative abstraction as the mean to get vertically through the tree of the composite until the prime composite, the genus generalissimum, is met. The abstractive procedure is not able to get to prime matter, differently from what Chalcidius, Bonaventure, or the Summa Hallensis maintained. According to Bacon, only the analogical procedure is able to get to the metaphysical matter of the composite by examining its correlation to the form, horizontally. Although Bacon does not answer this question directly, it seems plausible to suppose that, following his line of thought, prime matter can be known by a combination of these methods in two steps. First, by abstraction, one can get to the prime composite, the genus generalissimum. Second, by analogy, one can consider the hylomorphic components of the prime composite, which are prime matter and the first form. As we have seen, Bacon's ontology is very generous. It crucially distinguishes between two different considerations of matter. On the one hand, and properly speaking, matter is the metaphysical component of the composite, which can be known by analogy to the form. On the other hand, matter is the functional substrate of the composite, which can be known by abstraction. Evidently, the distinction between secondary and metaphysical matter is not original to Bacon. However, his ontology accomplishes a strict distinction between the two meanings of matter, physical and metaphysical, privileging the former to the latter. Proper matter is only the hylomorphic partner of the form within the composite. Accordingly, prime matter carries out a rather minor role in Bacon's ontology in comparison with other authors of his time who often position prime matter as the direct ingredient of first substances. In turn, Bacon entrusts prime matter with a function that is ontologically prior, because prime matter is the ingredient of the first genus, yet the function carried out by prime matter is also epistemologically minimal, since it does not play any central role as explanatory device in either metaphysics or natural philosophy. The function of central explanatory device is indeed carried out by secondary matters, to which it is now clear both definition 4 and 5 of the Communia Naturalium are related. The functions of potency of X to become Y and that of substrate of change are both carried out by secondary matters. It is in reason of this epistemological and ontological distinction that, according to Bacon, prime matter has not the relevance and pervasiveness that it shows in other metaphysical systems, like Rufus's or Aquinas's. The main focus of Bacon's speculations on matter is not prime matter, but natural matter, the third level of the tree of the composite, and itself a hylomorphic composite.